The killing of Mr. Gray while in police custody was sort of the match, if you will, that sort of lit something that had been fueling for years. Those neighborhoods have been suffering from inequality, segregation, racially and economically.
They are X'd out of the labor market. They have insufficient education. They've been sucked out of communities in large numbers and dropped into the juvenile justice and criminal justice system. And structurally, they don't have a way to participate.
They have an expectation of incarceration because they see that happening to all of their friends and neighbors and siblings. And that creates a real anger and frustration. You're beginning to see people express that anger and frustration around these extreme acts of violence.
Many of the communities within urban America are closed societies.
I think the history of racial inequality in this country has really compromised our ability to treat people fairly.
Sometimes racism is held by an individual. There's really individual bias. But more often than not, it's a systemic kind of racism. Sometimes we call it structural racism.
I don't think that diversity is the barrier. You've got a black mayor, a black police chief in the city of Baltimore. You've really got to deal with the core problems of underemployment and undereducation and chronic poverty. That's the way you change a city.
One of the things that this uprising presented was really a police system that is not working, where people feel harassed, where there's way too many arrests. There's an institution here that's not being held accountable.
We need more communication and transparency to provide the public with consistent, immediate information about what the police are doing.
That arms advocates and communities to demand that these are the sets of ways in which they are being policed by their departments.
And empathy is absolutely an indispensable ingredient of true justice.
It's absolutely unconscionable that when children in urban schools are participating in just, really minor infractions, that we suspend them and we expel them from school, and we set them on a pathway to the criminal justice system, as opposed to building within our school system and keep that child in school.
We spent $6 billion on jails and prisons in 1980. We spent $80 billion last year, and there's a lot you can do to help the poor and communities of color recover not only from lack of jobs and education, from drug dependency and drug use, but from all kinds of structural problems. We could actually really resurrect hope.
I think Ferguson, Freddie Gray, I think these incidents are going to communicate to people that the old way of doing things, the old way of policing, and the old way of addressing substance abuse and structural poverty are failures. And so new ways are going to have to be undertaken. And I think that's going to happen.
We do need to shape the narrative. Yes, there was a night of just absolute chaos. But the very next morning, the community came together and cleaned up. No elected official called for it. Instead, let us all come together. The residents of Baltimore City and the residents of those communities took ownership and responsibility, and they started the cleanup process.
My office is directly across the street from the church where Freddie was laid to rest. And that night, we stayed at the church close to midnight with a group of adult men, right, from the gangs and from other walks of life. And over the course of that dialogue, you began to see all of us as equals.
It has truly invigorated particularly a younger cohort of activists who, before now, were not activists.
That kind of enthusiasm, that kind of hopefulness will actually change what the equation is for our political leaders, and that they themselves will demand different kinds of programs and practices so that people really have much more justice and equality.
I like what I see out my window when I'm driving to work. I see hope. I see children in playgrounds.
I see the entire intersection of North and Pennsylvania singing in unison.
And this latest unrest and difficulty actually bolsters my belief that the city is on the rise.
And so we have to take advantage of this moment and turn it into a movement.
My name is Tomi Hiers, and on behalf of Baltimore's Promise, its board of directors and stakeholders, many of whom are in the room this morning, we want to welcome you to Baltimore. We're so happy to have you here that we timed the Light City Festival to coincide with this meeting. I hope that you all have an opportunity to participate in some of the events that are going to be happening in and around the Inner Harbor. But seriously, Baltimore's Promise, it's a collaborative that's composed of government leaders, higher education, business, nonprofit, and philanthropists. And we're all really focused on how can we improve outcomes on behalf of the youth in our city. We have 5 very basic but I think ambitious goals where we want all of the babies born in our city to be born healthy. We want our children to enter kindergarten ready to learn. We want our young people to achieve at grade level in at least reading and math. We want them to graduate from high school not just on time, but prepared to move to the next step without needing remediation. And then we want them to be career ready. So whether we're talking about opportunity youth or young people who get that skills training credential or that college degree, are they in fact ready for work? And can they get a job where they can make a living wage to support themselves and their families? Baltimore's Promise was created to serve as that backbone organization that's solely focused on guiding this work. Our mission is really focused on how can we align our budgetary and strategic priorities, but also how can we advance public policy on behalf of the youth in our city. And it's critical work that we can't do alone, that we're doing with more than 200 stakeholders who are around our tables. There are a number of my colleagues here in the room this morning, and they, like me, we've dedicated our lives and our careers on, how can we improve our city? How can we make Baltimore the best possible place that it can be? And as a lifelong Baltimorean, I have to honestly say that I love my city, like I'm sure many of you love the cities in which you live. The Baltimore that I know, that my colleagues and I know, it has its challenges, it also has its gems. It's a city that can't be understood by watching old reruns of The Wire or Homicide, nor can it be understood through 30-second news clips or catchy sound bites. For us, Baltimore, it's a vibrant city. It has rich history and culture that extends beyond the Inner Harbor, and it laid the foundation that helped to build this great country that many of us love. It's a city that's composed of more than 225 neighborhoods with over 600,000 individuals who both want and need their city to be a place to raise healthy, well-prepared children. It's also a city that's home to community leaders who are very passionately committed to being a part of transformational solutions to make our city better on behalf of its youth. And we collectively have a vision that's steeped in opportunity where not only can individuals have a place at the table, but they can actually reach the table. They have the tools that they need to eat the meal that's on the table, but more importantly, they know how to use those tools. I know that many of you have similar visions for your communities back home, and you've either launched or revamped collaboratives that help you to grapple with some of the fundamental questions around how to increase access to opportunity, how to increase outcomes on behalf of youth. And I think that while there are some differences between our respective efforts, there are indeed more similarities than there are all differences. And I think that we can also agree that this work is hard. In fact, this is one of the hardest jobs I've ever had in my life. But to paraphrase something that Marita said yesterday, I think the juice is definitely worth the squeeze. At least it is here in Baltimore. So over the next 2 days, I hope that you have an opportunity to really get out and enjoy our city. And I hope that you'll take advantage of all the sessions that have been organized for you. But most important, I hope that you'll use this as an opportunity to connect with and learn from each other. Because I think that's what many of these convenings really offer for a lot of us. Sometimes this work can be very lonely. And so whether you have an opportunity to connect with a peer across the hall or across town, or meeting for pancakes like I do with my friend Jonathan all the time, or whether it's a peer from across the country, being able to have those connections, it's something that's really huge. And I think it's our collective responsibility to reach out and find a way to support each other as we dig down in the trenches, whether it's in City Hall or on a city block, to make things better for youth in our cities. I'm looking forward to taking everything that I'm going to learn from all of you during the course of today, or stealing it, if you will, and taking it back to Baltimore's Promise so that I, along with my friends who are in the room, can continue to strive to make a difference on behalf of youth in our city. So again, welcome to Baltimore. And I hope that you enjoy the next 2 days and networking with each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tomi. We just met maybe a month ago, but I feel like we have already connected in so many ways and will connect in so many more, and I'm really grateful for that terrific welcome. I really want to welcome all of you here. Baltimore is a wonderful city. Marita Irby and I, Marita's the co-founder of the forum. We spent 5 years driving from the DC area up to Baltimore every day to work for the International Youth Foundation. We've got a shout out to a couple of those folks who are here today. And so we really have seen Baltimore sort of change and grow and are excited that we were able to bring the national meeting here, and delighted that you arranged the Light Festival to be available for us so that we didn't have to come up with our own entertainment. So thank you for that. It saved us a little bit of money. We've got an exciting panel that's going to join me in a minute. But before we do that, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping to make sure you know why we are doing the things that we're doing in terms of the plenaries and workshops, and why we put the things in your bag that we did, because there was intent behind them. So just let me take a second to start with some of the big things. Tomi just mentioned the importance of making sure that young people are career ready. And one of the things we were delighted to be able to offer you, thanks to Altria, and I can't see out in the audience to see if Amber's here somewhere, but thanks to the generous donation of Altria, we're able to give you really, really hot off the press copies of Job Skills and Minority Youth. Bart Hirsch, the author, was not able to join us, but he actually did a talk with me a couple of weeks ago, which has been archived, and he's also willing, you'll have a little piece of paper inside of your book. He's also set up a webinar for folks that want to come on and ask questions. He was so sad that he wasn't able to join us here in person, but I had the pleasure of doing a pre-read of this, so I could put a blurb on the back. I think I have a blurb on the back. But in doing that, I was really, really impressed, because this was an example of what we're going to be talking about. This is an example of exactly how we push practice. Because he asked the question, what can we do to demonstrate to young people and demonstrate to our communities that young people are ready for work? And he thought, well, we can't control the labor market, so we can't basically use the measure of whether they're employed as evidence that we have done everything we can to be ready, have them ready for work, but we could take the job interview much more seriously. And so he actually worked with HR professionals in the companies that hire this is based in Chicago, got them together, got them to really sort of talk through the rubric of how they would do job interviews for entry-level young people who were coming in out of high school, and then really use that to build young people's skills for doing job interviews, which was not really the sort of dress well, make sure you wear a tie, make eye contact. Those things were there, but he really found that what those HR professionals were looking for were young people who could authentically talk about the skills that they had and give concrete examples of those skills. And so what you'll read in the book, which is exciting, is how, by working backwards from what would be a successful job interview that allowed young people, that had that HR professional saying, I would hire this person if I had a job. I'd hire them with enthusiasm. And working backwards, what he found was that you were able to help young people not just build skills, but more importantly, recognize that they have already built skills that they hadn't named and they hadn't owned. So that's really our most concrete example of when we're talking about pushing practice, the kinds of basic things that we're going to be able to do. You also have, and you're going to hear from Jenny in a few minutes, you also have, thanks to the Wallace Foundation, the Foundations for Young Adult Success. Exciting, exciting piece of work that came out, I guess about a year ago, 9 months ago, that a lot of you are probably already familiar with, but we're delighted to be able to make sure you've got your own copies in case you've just been downloading it off of the web, which is certainly what my copy looks like until now. And this was just really groundbreaking, consistent, but groundbreaking work to look across disciplines and define really what readiness looks like. and what it has to do, what we do to help young people build a sense of agency, and then dig deeper, which we're going to learn about in a minute, to say what are those practices that help us get young people ready. So in really moving from last year, pushing an effort to say, we really do understand a lot more about those skills and competencies that young people need to have to be ready. We're delighted that now we can come back and give you some concrete examples, both up here on the stage, but also in your bags, about what readiness actually looks like. You also have in your bags, not the book, because we weren't able to do that just yet, but the flyer on the exciting work, and you'll hear more about this as well, that Charles Smith and the folks at the Weikart Center have been doing to really understand how we can not only name and observe social emotional learning skills in organizations, but we can also really analyze and improve our practice. And so you hear a lot more about that. But that exciting work funded by the Susan Crown Exchange is up on the website. Charles will show you the book in a minute when he comes up. And you've got the flyer to get to all the web links in your materials. When I was with you last year, for those who were here last year, I talked about the Readiness Project and the research work that we were doing led by Stephanie Krause to get us a sense of, much like Jenny and her colleagues did at the Chicago Consortium, to really look across disciplines and see if we could come up with a common language to talk about and a common framework to talk about readiness, and then to zoom in on what those practices were. And I talked about the importance, which we're going to talk about today, of making sure we understand how, in a very concrete way, we can begin to adjust and align organizational practice, formal practice, to make room for developmental practices that we know are critically important for young people. And so while we weren't able to give you the whole piece, and I'll show you the big piece that's here, hang on one second. All right, so when you download or we get them printed and get them out to you, you'll see the whole big thing called Readiness by Design. You've got the key ideas, sort of 8-pager, in your materials. So that's really a demonstration of work that we've been doing and that some of our colleagues have been doing around the world, across the country, and some of it really is international as well as here in the US, to push forward on this idea of readiness and then to really push to say, what practices do we really have to be doing to support readiness? So those are the key sort of content pieces that you have. I also want to take a minute to let you know, I think most of this is on the left side of your folder, if you have a folder, that one of the things that we heard last year was that the forum is a complicated animal and you don't quite know all the pieces of it. So this year what we did was to give you basically an overview of each of the units of the forum. So you have that behind a piece that starts saying the forum. We have the Weikart Center for Youth Program Quality and the newly renamed, led by Marita Irby, Big Picture Approach Consulting, which are really our 2 technical assistance centers. And they're working with many of you across the country to either help you build quality improvement systems or really help you get the most out of your partnerships that are trying to use this, what we now call collective impact approach, or really just trying to align efforts to improve outcomes for young people and change policies. We have the Children's Cabinet Network, we have Spark Action, and then we have initiatives like the Readiness Project and like our Policy Alignment Initiative, and you'll have a panel talking about policy alignment on Thursday morning. So we wanted to make sure that you had information about each of those units, that you had names and faces put behind them, that you also know, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, that we really are increasingly focusing on what it really means to do evidence-based policy and practice. And we're delighted that we, with some recent funding from the Annie Casey Foundation and the Kresge Foundation, we're going to be able to push more into that area to supplement what WT Grant has been doing for us. So those are the things that you have. And I think also you have in here a lineup of, we see you once a year, but hopefully you hear us in webinars and thought leadership roundtables and read materials all through the year. And so you have a little bit of a calendar in your papers as well to just tell you the things that are coming up just over the next couple of months, because we want to make sure that when you leave here, you're staying in touch with us. And probably the most important thing that you have in your folder is how to stay in touch with each other. So you've got a participant list that gets you all the way down to email addresses. This really is a conference about networking, and so we want to make sure that you've got all the information that you need to be able to do that. We're going to try to hold to our word this year and really give you more time for networking. So the lunch today is unscripted. It's your time to be able to talk to each other. Rita will give you some opening remarks, but I'm sure we'll keep them brief to make sure that you really have time to network and your evenings are open to enjoy the Light Festival, go out to dinner in all these wonderful restaurants. So we are delighted that you're here, and I'm now delighted to really turn to this topic of what it really means to push practice. So I'm going to invite my panelists to come up and sort of jockey for seats with me. You've got their bios and information in your programs, so I'm not going to read them to you. But it looks like first coming up is Charles Smith, who's director of the David P. Weikart Center for Youth Program Quality, which is a part of the forum. Let's see who's coming next. We've got Barbara Langford, Youth Transition Funders Group director. You've got Michael Umpierre, who is from the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown and works with Shay Bilchik, for those of you who know Shay. You've got Jenny Nagaoka, who is from the University of Chicago Consortium on Chicago School Research. And then I'm going to turn around and join them and get us started in this conversation. And so I just want to start with this question. Charles made up this phrase, and I thought it was wonderful, that we really need to do more to push practice. So I want to ask each of you, when I called you and said, would you be willing to join us to talk for a little bit about pushing practice? Why did you say yes? I'm assuming because I have such a charismatic personality, but why this idea of pushing practice? What does that mean to you, and why is it important for us to not just talk about programs, but talk about practice? Ilene, why don't we start with you?
Thanks. I'm with the Annie Casey Foundation, and the foundation is devoted to developing brighter futures for the millions of children and families that might be at risk for poor education, economic, health, and social outcomes. And we believe that when communities do better, families do better. When families do better, kids do better. But there's an important part of this equation that when I heard your question about pushing practice came to mind and is really one of the focal points of our work, which is public systems. And by public systems, I mean schools, and particularly for the Casey Foundation, juvenile justice and child welfare systems. How can they be partners in helping communities, families, and children and youth be more successful? And in order to realize the best for the young people across the country, we think about how can we push practice with and for public systems so that communities are involved in positive change, so that the very best of what we know in terms of research and evidence is realized for children and youth, and that we're continually learning how to do this work better. So when I think about push practice, it means pushing public systems in partnership with communities and families who we want to be as successful as possible to realize positive change and changing how they do their work every day so that we can see the outcomes we're hoping for.
And Michael, you spend your time inside of some of these public systems. What do you see that makes you think it's important to push practice?
Well, I think that, and again, I'm Michael Umpierre with the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University, and I think that oftentimes what we see in the juvenile justice field in particular is that staff implement these various practices related to service delivery to young people and families, and those practices aren't necessarily linked to an overarching construct that derives directly from the research and derives directly from guiding principles. So for me, when I think about pushing practice, I think about the importance of, in any youth-serving agency context or system, of having a clear understanding of how what you do on a day-to-day basis in terms of service delivery, how that relates, how that's deliberately linked to those guiding principles, those values that stem from the research that we know shows what is effective in our field. So as an example, Karen, we at the center have a number of projects that are focused on developing and enhancing practices in the context of crossover youth and in the context of juvenile correctional facilities. Family engagement is one area that we know that the research shows is a critical component to enhancing outcomes for young people and families. The question for us is, how do we help agencies and systems think about family engagement at that practical level, as a way, sort of how you described it, looking backwards? How do we increase the practices of making sure that families are connected to their young people, that they have a meaningful voice at the table when it comes to case planning regarding services and placement? Thinking about those pieces, because what we know about the research is that family engagement is correlated with better outcomes.
So Charles, you've been pushing practice for more than a decade and doing it through assessment. So you made up this term. Why did you? Why do you think it was so important, after all the decades of work you've been doing, to actually name it push practice and sort of actually push this idea even more?
Yeah. So I'm Charles Smith, and I work at the David P. Weikart Center, which is part of the forum. So one of the reasons I agreed to be on the panel, because my boss called me up and asked me to. No, but it's a pleasure to talk about this subject. So we have been working to build quality improvement systems in the nonprofit and public sectors in out-of-school time organizations for almost a decade now. And what we have seen happen again and again is the transition of organizational cultures from more discipline-focused and from more monitoring-focused behaviors and cultures to more collaborative and improvement-focused cultures, where there is more explicit discussion about, gee, what are we trying to do here? What are the learning practices that are going on in this setting? Who are our kids? What do they need? How do we build the most important unit of energy in that setting, which is their motivation to be there? So those conversations, there are a lot of really skilled people in our field, and they have those conversations quite easily, especially if you put some information they can use in their hands, a little bit of evidence from their own setting. But our feeling was, how do we, so we have these quality improvement systems moving forward. Our clients are constantly asking, how much is enough? What's good? What's the threshold for high? So we said, let's start working on it. Let's figure out how we think about how we can push those existing conversations about what the practices are to a higher level, and how we can get the performance measures also tweaked so that we can start to name what high is across the many kinds of practices that people use with kids.
So you're actually working with folks to really, and I think this is, I've come back to ask this question, to really not just understand what good practice is, but to actually start to know whether they're doing good practice, to have some objective ways to assess, to observe what they're doing, and say, yes, you're getting better. And so Jenny, you started with thinking about schools, but with the work that you did, you really broadened that to look. How important is this idea of actually being able to name and observe practice and break it down?
Oh, I think it's tremendously important, because the whole process of measuring it, one is you have to really define it and know what it is and create a certain level of clarity about it. One of the things we've also seen in my work with Chicago is that until you actually have a way of measuring it, you actually don't know where you stand. You don't actually know clearly if you're improving it, understanding how you might want to be improving it. It's really this essential ingredient for really changing practice, and I think it's a way that it helps practitioners understand their work better, to understand how they can improve it, and it really sort of transforms how people can potentially be thinking about their work.
And Barbara, last but certainly not least, you started out thinking about how inside of child welfare in particular, how to sort of bring in not just the concept of safety and security, but well-being, and how to make sure that practice inside of child welfare is really pushing to make sure young people are not just coming out of the system, but coming out of the system doing well. So where did this idea of practice fit into the work that you all have been doing and that you put into the wonderful document that I assume you have in your hand?
Yes. The Youth Transition Funders Group is a network of foundations, all of whom are investing to improve outcomes for vulnerable young people transitioning to adulthood, ages 14 to 25. So the notion of well-being has been a central unifying concept for our network particularly because we have a diverse set of funders who are investing in child welfare, who are investing in youth justice, who are investing in education and employment, who felt frustration that narrow, uncoordinated approaches were not helping to move the dial on improving outcomes for particularly vulnerable youth, young people who have been pushed out or dropped out of school, or young people who have been connected to the child welfare or youth justice system in some way, shape, or form. So the notion of well-being for particularly vulnerable youth had a lot of salience for our network in terms of being able to push both policy and practice to improve outcomes for this population. Being able to take that holistic approach to wellness, being able to look across a whole series of important well-being domains that all young people need to be healthy, successful, thriving adults, was an important first step. And after being able to develop that full framework and articulate what are the capacities that a young person needs to develop and how can families, communities, and public systems support well-being, that then became our yardstick for pushing practice. Because once you have that framework, once you have that common vision, I'm sure many collaboratives in the room can attest to having that clear, articulated vision for work that they're doing in their own communities as well, how then you push a policy and practice agenda becomes much easier. So then we had the yardstick to say, well, first we have to stop doing what's harmful to well-being. First, we have to take a look at discontinuing and deconstructing harmful practices that actually harm young people's well-being as opposed to support it. Patrick McCarthy from the Annie Casey Foundation is fond of saying a bad system trumps a good program anytime. And at YTFG, we extended that to really think about how bad policy can trump or in some cases significantly hinder good practice. So being able to push policy in addition to pushing practice at the systems organization down to the youth worker level is how our network really thought about being able to move forward on influencing both policy and practice in a complementary way.
Great. Charles, I'm going to come back to you for a second, and we've last year and really over this past year, thanks to wonderful reports like the consortium put out, we've just, and the work that you've just done with Susan Crown, we've just been zeroing in on the importance of making sure that we're supporting young people's social and emotional development. I mean, that's just become a common theme across all systems. So it's not just the after-school folks anymore, not even just the school folks. It's become an increased sort of undergirding of what we have to do in some ways to transform child welfare and juvenile justice, and it's sort of an accelerator that if we can get folks shifting their framework to include this idea of building social and emotional competence, that we can actually accelerate changes in practice. So let's just talk a little bit, and I'll get you to have some examples of what does it look like when you really get people to zoom in on naming what those social and emotional skills and competencies are, and then looking at whether they're doing everything they can to be supporting those. Even after-school programs have official practice, whether they're teaching young people to build boats or be advocates or put on plays. There's an official arc to the work that they're doing, and even though they're youth development organizations, you found that it was really important for them to really deconstruct and see what it really takes, even inside of that kind of generally supportive environment, to push practice. So let's start with where it was easiest to really dig in and make sure we're doing the things that really support the development of those important skills and competencies, and then see what it looks like in more challenging settings.
Well, so we, in the past work that the immediate past work we've been doing that resulted in the guide, Preparing Youth to Thrive, we were able to find 8 exemplary programs serving vulnerable adolescents. And we called them exemplary because they went through a really deep application process, and they could really describe their work very clearly in either a disciplinary or a clinical language. They could talk about what they were trying to achieve. We also did a lot of performance measurement in these organizations, and they were exceptionally high quality, and they showed exceptionally large gains in youth skills across a range of SEL domains. So we really came to believe they were exemplary programs. So, what are the SEL practices? That's a thick question. That book's 200 pages. There's a lot to say there. But part of the important thing was that these programs really knew who their kids were, And they were, they were separating out. There were children who have been hurt and who have emotional triggers and who you have to know deeply in order to respond to them and to do the co-regulation, to stick with them in the tough moments of the work. And then there are the other kids who live in the same neighborhood, but they're basically doing pretty good. And all of these programs intentionally recruited a diversity of those kids to bring them together. And then they put them in touch with an opportunity structure, right? They had a challenging project. You built a boat, you did organizing, you organized campaigns in the Boston Public Schools, you did real live work that was hard and had lots of challenges, but there were adults there who were very good at stepping in and helping at the challenging moments. And at all the challenging moments, there were social emotional skills to be learned. They were different skills for different kids, and again, different depending on the needs of the kids, but they were all in the room and they were all in the cohort. And so that introduction or that opportunity, Robert Putnam has called it the opportunity gap, right? Where do young people get opportunities to build skills, deep skills, so they can feel engaged and so they can have the experience of an adult that looks at them and sees a skilled person? Because when someone reflects back to you your skill and your ability, that's a very powerful moment. You try to produce a lot of those moments. So these programs had this unique combination, and again, there's not a new idea in this conversation, right? We've been talking about these things for 45 years easily in the developmental sciences. But the combination of a rigorous, challenging project, a group of people to work with, and very skilled staff who knew how to step in and take kids through this curriculum and step in with responsive practices at the right moments and help them regulate. Help them channel emotion, help them focus and stay focused, to channel their attention towards certain kinds of goals. Those were the common practices, but there were a number of common practices, but those were the really important things across the several programs.
And Jenny, as you all did your research, not only did you do an amazing job, and you all should look, the publication is both gorgeous and very informative, but you did an amazing job of sort of naming those skills and competencies and putting them into a framework that culminates in young people having a sense of identity and agency. But you also then went in and said, what are those sort of almost micro practices that allow young people to actually build those skills? Talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because we've been sort of like this whole idea, particularly in education in many ways, of thinking about social emotional learning is actually relatively new. I mean, it's one of those things that's sort of funny because in after-school program and youth development, people have been thinking about these things actively for a really, really long time, but they're relatively new to education. But yet they're not, because I think in a lot of ways the approach that we think about what it actually takes to be developing these skills and factors in young people, we kind of go back to Dewey. It's sort of this idea that the way that young people, and actually all of us, really learn is through this process of experiencing and having the opportunities to reflect on those experiences. And so we really are pushing teachers and youth workers and everybody to be thinking about how is it that you can be providing developmental experiences to young people where they're being exposed to new ideas, seeing models for what's possible, giving a chance to actually actively engage and tinker with ideas and practice them over, do something that actually has meaning to them. And then it's not just the fact of like doing these things and doing things and experiencing them, but actually making sure that you have an explicit opportunity for young people to reflect on them. I think we're starting to be better at saying, okay, young people, in order to really grow and develop and learn, they need to be, going outside of their comfort zone in terms of activities or going outside into new settings. But we're not always being as intentional about the reflection part of it. And the way we actually start to internalize these experiences is by having the space to be going into this process of inquiry or having young people actually asking questions about, so what actually happened here? How did that go? Did I like it? How could I make that process go better next time around? How is this like other things that I've experienced? And we really think about these two sides of it as really being how we can create meaningful experiences and really help young people grow and develop in a much more holistic way.
So how do you, all that sounds wonderful, how do you get that happening inside of a school, in a classroom, in which there's already a lot of definition of what official practice is?
I mean, it is one of the biggest struggles. I mean, I think we found this throughout, because I feel like I talked to out-of-school people, and there's, it always resonates with them. Educators already feel really, really overburdened, so it really is a struggle. And so we're thinking about different ways in which this sort of thing is already starting to happen, or there's more obvious links. So something like that's starting to be bigger, like in the state of Illinois, is like civic education. And so they're actually saying in this process that it's not just about kind of civics where there's a constitution test, but really how do you actually act as an engaged citizen? This is actually going to be a graduation requirement in the state. And so we're trying to figure out how is it that we can show teachers that it's possible and make it really be embedded in this idea that their role as teachers is not just to transmit knowledge to them, but create a living experience where kids are having the opportunity to be out in their community and see what that is and actually see that as being part of the educational process.
So Michael, you're working with systems that are focused on young people who are in custody, young people who are crossing back and forth between child welfare and juvenile justice. These folks have lots of requirements, lots of things on them. As you said, they may get a list of practices that are useful, but you talked a little bit earlier about the importance of having them have a framework that helps them really guide and decide. Can you sort of give us an example of that and get as concrete as you can and sort of telling us what it really looks like when somebody's actually sort of pushed to change practice?
So we have, at the center, we've developed two practice models. One, the crossover youth practice model, and more recently, the youth in custody practice model. The former is a model, a framework, that enables communities to break down those traditional silos between child welfare and juvenile justice and other partners, to serve that population of young people that is involved in both the child welfare and the juvenile justice system. I can tell you from my own experience working in DC as the Chief of Staff for the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, that oftentimes you have, even though it's the same population of kids, you have that breakdown regarding the coordination and collaboration around the service delivery. And so we at the center, since 2010, we have been in 96 jurisdictions around the country. Here in Maryland, we're in Montgomery County and Prince George's County, helping systems implement this crossover youth practice model. And essentially what it is a framework that, again, derives from the research as to what we know works in serving this population, that lays out what communities should be doing to break down those silos, to be collaborating with one another to serve this population. So we work with the communities to implement this model down to the practice level, looking at things like how do you identify at the very front end of the system when the young person crosses over from child welfare to juvenile justice? How do you go about lessening the burden on youth and families who are involved in multiple systems and may be assessed and assessed and assessed over again? How do we better communicate around case planning? How do we get families and young people at the table regarding that development of the case plan? And then looking at issues of permanency and well-being long after the case is closed. So we work very closely with the communities to develop those elements that are intended to achieve that long-term sustainability of these reform efforts. So looking at developing protocols, looking at training structures going forward across agencies, cross-training, looking at quality assurance measures, and looking at performance measurement. This has been a highly successful model. We've had an evaluation component. The outcomes are exceedingly positive. We just recently launched the Youth in Custody practice model, which is a similar effort, but designed to distill the research as to what we know works with respect to that population of young people who are in the custody of juvenile correctional agencies. And we'll be working with 4 jurisdictions around the country to implement that practice model as well. So there's a strong emphasis on laying out what the practices look like. So in the youth in custody practice model, we're looking at case planning, we're looking at what services need to be delivered at the facility level, what does re-entry and transition planning look like, and then what does aftercare community-based services look like.
So let me challenge you a bit and connect the dots back and forth. So when Charles talked about sort of inside of this youth development space, and I'll come back to the others as well, he talked about the idea of really setting up, you're really setting up a challenge for young people in which you assume there's going to be struggle and frustration, which then triggers an opportunity for the youth worker to actually help that young person build skills and learn how to sort of deal with social and emotional issues in the context of that challenge. So you're working with systems where young people have clearly already had challenges. They're in the child welfare system, they're in the juvenile justice system, and you're working with professional staff who don't necessarily see that their job is to help those young people actually to present a positive challenge to those young people, and then have the skills to actually help them resolve many of the issues that got them there in the first place in some instances. So give me a concrete example of where, when we're talking about the kind of practice that Charles was talking about, we can really dig in, because we're really trying to test the idea that we can actually move practice across systems. So give us something to make us optimistic that when we get down to really, when you have, you know, a youth worker, a youth professional inside of one of these systems, working with a young person in some kind of, doing some kind of, you know, sort of experience, and something goes wrong.
Yeah.
How do they actually use developmentally appropriate practice?
Sure.
And how do you encourage that?
So in my former capacity as the co-coordinator of the National Center for Youth in Custody, which was an OGJDP-sponsored training and technical assistance center, I had the opportunity of getting all around the country to evaluate juvenile correctional facilities and help them improve their practices. As part of that process, to answer your question, I was in a facility that was where young women were treated. And it was a secure facility. I won't say where it was. It will remain nameless. But I was talking with the staff in the facility, and the population of young women in this facility were, you know, some of the most vulnerable young people in the jurisdiction. High, you know, rates of past trauma, abuse, what have you. And I was talking with the staff about their practice of using pepper spray with this population as a way to intervene when those types of incidents occur at the facility. And I was trying to understand what their rationale was behind the use of this practice that we all really know, and the research shows, is harmful. And appreciated, you know, Barbara's comments about looking at, you know, what those practices that lead to harm for young people and making sure that we're moving away from it. What I was told in that particular facility was that for these young women who have such deep trauma, it actually is less traumatic for them to use pepper spray on them to stop an incident as opposed to physically putting one's hands on them to break up the incident. It was a remarkable position to take. It was based in this. I think the person was well intended, and again, this was a high-level leader within the facility. The person was well intentioned in that he was thinking about, you know, the trauma that the young women were experiencing, but it was completely contrary to what we know should be happening. So part of what we do is, as part of our training and technical assistance projects through the crossover youth practice model, this particularly would be in the youth in custody practice model, is we help them realize what the research really is and to talk about those harmful practices that should be eliminated. But it's a real challenge, Karen. And I will say that I think in hearing what, you know, Jenny laid out and Charles, relationships between your staff and young people, whether it's educators, whether it's your correctional staff, whether it's your social workers, it all comes down to relationships in terms of achieving those outcomes. And if you are implementing harmful practices like the use of pepper spray, you have to be thinking what that means, what that impact will be on the relationship with the young person going forward.
Great, thanks for sharing that. I think that really helps. It helps us both understand the challenge and then begin to think about what it is that we can do when we have these big conversations about we need to push practice, we need to use evidence-based programs. To get down to that level of detail is what we have to be working on. So Ilene, you took on an ambitious task, or the Casey Foundation did, and you've been helping to lead it. As you said, of really helping communities sort of assess where there's a critical need to change practice based on looking at the data about how well their young people are doing, and then decide what to implement, and then implement it. Can you talk a little bit about what it takes to actually push practice beyond saying select the best and most appropriate evidence-based program, which we hear a lot. And we could have a different panel on, sort of the unintended consequences of telling people to select an evidence-based program that perhaps they can't really afford to implement or can't implement with fidelity. But you've been trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. So help us go from recognizing that a community needs to be doing something different to just getting through to actually making sure those practices are working.
Thanks. Well, Barbara invoked my boss, Patrick McCarthy's comment that we hear quite a lot, a bad system trumps a good program every time. And it was his idea for us to develop a framework for how do we get the best out of evidence-based programs. And so my team and I and many partners, Barbara is one of them, have been developing a framework called Evidence to Success, so that the end goal of which is, of course, improve child and youth outcomes and well-being. And we believe that one of the important mechanisms for making that happen is to get a portfolio of evidence-based programs appropriate to a particular community's needs in place. And this framework was developed with all of those challenges in mind. So what do we do when this notion of a bad system, or a system that isn't believing in the power of evidence-based programs? So one element of the framework is to establish or identify community boards, which would include public system leaders and community members and leaders who are leading this work in terms of selecting priorities and leading the charge for pulling this whole thing off. Another challenge is funding and sustainability. So another element of the framework is a financing approach and a financing toolkit to consider from the very outset. So if we pick programs, how are we going to fund them? And really importantly, how are we going to sustain them? Another important element, as you mentioned, Karen, is understanding what's really going on in communities. So the community members, as well as the public system representatives, have their expertise and perspective, but we also want to hear from the youth themselves. So we have developed and employed a youth experience survey for youth in middle and high school so that they can tell us themselves, using validated measures, but they can tell us themselves what's going on, what's working well for them, what's not working so well. And we're looking, because Evidence to Success is designed to be a prevention and early intervention framework. So how can we try to identify and stop problems before they start or before they get too serious? We're looking to learn from these youth what our risk and protective factors are for them, as well as where they're doing on particular outcomes. And then another important piece here is, how do you implement those programs well? So how do you make sure you choose the right programs for this population, for the right kids, for the right reasons? And I'll give just a quick example and also put in a plug for a 2 o'clock session today, where colleagues from Providence, which is one of our Evidence to Success sites, and one of my colleagues from the Casey Foundation will be talking much more about their work. But after the community board in Providence looked at the survey data and other information that they had, one of the things that really struck them was trauma symptoms among their youth. And they prioritized this area, did a screening of some middle school students that were identified by school staff and teachers, found really high rates of incidents like being attacked, separation from an important adult in their lives, seeing someone using or holding a real gun, and decided based on that information and a real careful look at what are some of the evidence-based programs that are out there that are high quality that would meet our needs and our demographics, to choose to employ cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, an evidence-based program. And they've been doing this and already have seen reports from parents and teachers that are indicating real positive outcomes. An early assessment showed 35% reduction in some of these trauma symptoms among the participating youth. And because of this whole process, thinking about what are we prioritizing, why are we choosing this program, thinking very carefully about the implementation along the way, checking in to see, is this working? What's working or not? What do we need to change? They have embraced this at multiple levels, policy level as well as practice level, and when we talk to the kids themselves, just really powerful testimonials for, wow, I now have some coping mechanisms when I get frustrated or angry. Wow, I now understand how to interact with my peers when something is being triggered for me. So that's the kind of change we're seeing, but also I think it's important that it's not just, oh great, we picked a program, now we've solved everything, but all of those steps along the way are essential to picking wisely, but also making for lasting change.
I'm going to get some examples from Jenny and Barbara. I can't see out into the audience very well, but we've got about 15 minutes left, and if you all have questions that you'd like to ask of any of the panelists, I'm going to ask that you stand up. Somebody who doesn't have light shining in their face are going to notice that you're standing up and hand you a microphone and then signal me that you're standing up, and then we will get some questions from you all. But Barbara, as we were talking earlier, you were talking about the importance of really sort of looking from policy to practice and sort of understanding how you really test it to see whether the elements that you think are critical are there and whether things that really don't work are being taken out. Can you just give us an example of what that looks like when you really try to get in there and dissect policy and push it all the way down?
Well, to take the great program models that you're developing and are such an asset to the field, and to take the implementation science around evidence to success and put those together, if we still have the bad policy overlaying on top of that great program and that great implementation science, we're still going to have challenges. And one of the first harmful policies that YTFG called out in terms of deconstructing was decriminalizing school behavior. So if we know there's going to be a trigger, if we know a normal adolescent response to that trigger might be an outburst, and we have a program in place that could support it, if the first call is to a police officer, that child's not going to take advantage of that program. That child's not going to learn the skills that are necessary to ameliorate that behavior in the future. So ensuring that those policy frameworks are the right policy frameworks so we can take advantage of what we know about good programs, we can take advantage about what we know about good implementation science. The Sierra Health Foundation's Positive Youth Justice Initiative is a great example of trying to tie all those pieces together, where they're seeking to reform local youth justice systems by applying a positive youth development approach. It's a pretty novel idea to put youth development principles in a youth justice system, but from the top to the bottom, from training for judges who are making decisions about the adjudication of a case, training for the chief of police to think about how they're infusing youth development principles and practices into how they respond to a response from a school, how they choose to interact with that young person if they do come into custody, how they choose to divert that young person and providing a program that works as opposed to detaining them or incarcerating them, which we know is costly and only has bad outcomes. So unless there's a significant community risk, there's so many alternatives for young people to experience a more positive intervention that actually leads to improved outcomes, that supports their well-being, all the way down to practices at the frontline staff, by principals, by frontline teachers, by youth workers, by probation officers, to think about how you then put those positive youth development principles in practice in a more supportive policy frame. So continuing to push on no shackling within a detention center, continuing to push on close the detention centers altogether because they're not effective and they're not getting us to good outcomes. So we don't even have to worry about trying to improve practice in a bad system, close that part of the system altogether. I think that's an important way to continue to push on a whole host of fronts in order to get at both being well and being ready to move into the next phase of their lives.
That's great. So we're not going to close down schools, Jenny.
Yeah.
So
we have in Chicago, actually.
Or altogether.
Yeah.
But you've talked about the importance of bringing data in.
Right.
And making sure people see data on how their individual students are doing across the board. How have you helped them use that data to actually change practice?
Right, so one of the things at the consortium that we do is we don't just see ourselves as researchers who publish in journals. It's really important for us to be doing things that actually affects practice and is really helping practitioners be able to think about their work more effectively. And one of the ways that we think a lot about this and we sort of see as our big example around this is some work that my colleagues at the consortium, Elaine Allensworth and Melissa Roderick, have done around the importance of ninth grade. And so ninth grade in Chicago is this transition from elementary school to high school. So developmentally, there's a lot going on. And what we've seen is that the grades that students get in ninth grade, particularly failures, shapes a lot about whether or not they're going to go on to graduate from high school. We've also looked at it in ways that are saying that it's something about what's going on in high schools, because these are kids who a lot of times have done well in elementary schools, but then are struggling when they hit high school. So it's something about what's happening in the high school environment that is causing this to happen. And then talking about the role of measurement, we developed an ninth grade on-track indicator, which looks at, which determines whether or not kids, is looking at how kids are performing in ninth grade. So they have to have enough credits at the end of ninth grade to be promoted to 10th grade, and they can't have more than one course failure in a core course in the ninth grade. This has been really predictive about high school graduation. So that's kind of what happened on the research side. We have a close relationship with the Chicago Public Schools, and so they started seeing our research and they started thinking about this, and they put the freshman on track indicator on their accountability system, sort of signaling that this actually is something that matters to them. They also helped set the conditions for changing things in terms of developing data systems, which allowed practitioners to actually see the performance of their ninth graders both in 8th grade and monitoring how they were doing in terms of attendance and grades much more closely. And so sort of these conditions were set up in a way across the district, but interestingly, they sort of said, okay, we're sending out a signal that this is important, and we're going to be providing data to help you think about this. But they didn't actually have any kind of real directive policies or programs that said this is how it's going to take place. So it's great that they set up these conditions, but of course, those are really not terribly sufficient to actually see change at the ground level. And so the consortium has a partner organization, the Network for College Success, which at the time was working deeply with about 10 to 12 high schools and high school principals. And they were working closely with these principals and their ninth grade teams to really be understanding how can you use data to think about a problem. So data is not meant just as an accountability mechanism, but it's really a way to better understand what's going on in your school, see the patterns across students, differentiating among students. And they also push this idea that how kids are performing in class and whether or not they ultimately graduate from high school is not a kid characteristic, it's actually something that practitioners can do something about. And as they were working with these practitioners, they really started to see changes in how practitioners were thinking about their role and what they could actually be doing to support students in terms of making sure that they're coming to school, coming to class, and passing their classes. And so they really pushed the principals to create structured time for ninth grade teachers to be meeting together, talk about students, engage in data, setting up protocols so that they are actually having productive conversations and really thinking about what the needs of their individual kids were. And so it kind of went from this idea that, oh, these ninth graders are failing their algebra class, let's just send them to algebra tutoring, because clearly the source of failure is about not understanding algebra. And even in some ways it ultimately is. but it also pushed teachers to start having really important one-on-one conversations with kids and sort of saying, okay, you're failing algebra. What's going on here? Like, is it because you're not coming to class? And if you're not coming to class, why aren't you coming to class? Is it because this is, your class is starting at 8 o'clock in the morning and you have to take your little brother to school and so you're having trouble getting to school on time? Or is it because you don't really have a place to study at home, and really helping them problem solve and sort of seeing that, that A, this is a problem that they can do something about, data can help them identify it, and really to sort of say that they can problem solve, both amongst the teachers, but also with the students to really be changing what's going on inside of the classroom. And so we sort of have this kind of through line from a research finding and then actually seeing how this plays out on the ground and how district policy can actually support those sorts of changes.
Great. All right, so let's take some questions. I can't see if there are questions out there. Somebody will tell me if there are. Is anyone standing? Is that someone standing or just getting coffee? I can't tell.
Karen, you got one
To
right
your
there.
left.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't see behind the podium. Yes.
Or wave or something maybe.
One over here.
Oh, there's one.
Over there, yeah.
Hello. My name is Adrienne Clutter. I'm from Montgomery County, Maryland. We have a population of about 1 million residents. So, first of all, thank you for being here, and I hope I can, you've got my wheels turning, and I hope I can articulate my thought or question clearly. We talked a little bit about the right kids. So, one of the struggles that we have in Montgomery County is that our staff are having those deep conversations, and we're finding out the trauma from some of our young people. We have a lot of unaccompanied minors, kids in all situations. The struggle we have from stakeholders is they always argue with us about, are you getting the right kids in your program? And we say, yes, in fact, we're getting the right kids. But we're not handing them an intake form, and we're trying to get high school and middle school students to come in and say, hey, what kind of trauma have you experienced? And also articulating the range of trauma, whether it's been a recent divorce or a bullying situation, or maybe a young person that has just come to the U.S. on their own. And so we have a real big push and pull between articulating that we have the right kids in our program and being able to identify that we do have the right kids, and also social equity. Because on the other side, the problem is that we don't want to create a program that's all of a sudden labeled for those kids. Oh, those are the kids who are in need, or those are the kids who are struggling. And those kids, the kids who are sort of labeled in that capacity, don't want to be in that program either, because they don't see themselves as one of those kids. They see themselves as a kid. So it's that push-pull between social equity and saying that we do have the right kids in our program, and how do we articulate, or what types of things can we do to identify to stakeholders, policymakers, that we are in fact getting the right kids in our program.
Tackle it.
So one way to think about that is, regardless of who the kids are, how prepared are the staff for whatever the kids bring. So one of the things that we found in the SEL Challenge, in these exemplary programs, were there was a staff competency was there around the E in SEL. So emotion is really different than cognition. It involves cognition, but it's a really, it's the body's being doped, right? It happens really fast. We call them sensory affective motor schema, right? There's a cue in the environment, there's an affective response, and you start to act. And you're not conscious. So what does staff do when things start happening really fast? And so what we discovered across these programs were these very powerful responsive, what we called them responsive practices. We labeled them coaching, modeling, scaffolding, facilitating. There were a few. And they were what the adults were able to do in the moments of challenge when things started to happen fast. Now, if it happened that you've got a child with severe traumatic experience that requires a clinical approach that's deeper than these programs had available, then these staff, there was a social worker in every program, and they were able to make those kind of clinical referrals. But the main point was just about anybody could come, and the staff were trained to be able to respond to the things that happened really quickly. If you think about 20 years ago when everyone was being trained in conflict resolution, from preschool to high school age kids, in almost every scheme there were those practices about approach calmly, ask kids to restate the issue. There were those things that you did right then. And so we came to believe, because we were worried about this issue of how do you deal with kids who need clinical support, who have issues that you can't deal with easily in a youth program. But all of these programs navigated that line because they were ready to respond in the moment, to calm things down, and then make the clinical decision about whether the young person needed some other kind of support.
Is there another question out there?
Okay, first question, is it okay to record you? This is for a research paper as well. To record you as I'm doing this question.
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you.
Is it okay for me to record you as I'm reading the question? It's for a research paper as well.
Sure. Is that right? Yes.
Okay, my name is Shania Lemon. I am from Eastern Florida. I am here with Brevard Family Partners. My question is, how many of you guys have actually been to these low-income places that you talk about and actually interact with the youth? Because I know from firsthand experience that a lot of the things that you guys are throwing out aren't working, or work for some kids, not others, or it's just you guys think it's good, or the numbers say it's good, but it doesn't actually help.
Okay, so the question is, how many of the panelists actually have been in the environments that we're talking about? Okay. Panelists.
Well, at the Youth Transition Funders Group, youth engagement has been a core principle for our network from the very beginning. So particularly with our foster care work group, we have ensured that there have been young people who have been alumni of foster care, who have been part and parcel of every decision that foster care work group has made since its inception in 2002. It's been great in recent years. We're starting to expand the number of young people who have permanent seats at the table in the decision-making structures of our funders network. In addition, that experience is critical to informing the priorities, informing the strategies that the network is engaged in, and as a set of practices that each of our foundational members go back and put into their grant making as well. So that practice of being connected and understanding of the communities that you're working in helps to ensure that there's not a disconnect for what someone's trying to achieve in partnership with the community and if it's actually being achieved. So that's, I think, a critical component, and it's actually recommendation number 1 in the YTFG document is to ensure that youth voice is baked in to all decision-making processes, all evaluations, all implementation plans. If you're not connected with young people in a really explicit and empowering way, you're losing an important part of any program or model that you're seeking to implement.
Go ahead.
I would just thank you for the question. I think that's really important consideration. And so, for example, when the Casey Foundation built this framework, it's just that, a framework for the community, including adults, parents, residents, youth, to make decisions about what's best for them. So we have ideas, but those are just ideas presented for the people in the community, including the youth, to choose what works for them.
And if I could add as well, I mean, with respect to the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, youth engagement is an extremely high priority in our initiatives. With respect to the crossover youth practice model, we regularly bring in the youth voice because it's so critical. The youth in custody practice model has a whole chapter dedicated to the importance of elevating the youth voice because it's so connected to outcomes, right? The research shows from a procedural fairness. So I'm a public defender in my background, and the research on procedural fairness shows that if a young person believes that he or she has had a meaningful experience and has been treated fairly by others, government officials, staff, they're much more likely to engage in the type of services and trying to achieve those outcomes that we're all trying to achieve. So in the juvenile correctional context, what that looks like is encouraging sites to develop things like youth councils. In fact, the youth in custody practice model cites the forum's excellent thinking around the development of youth councils. This is often an area that's overlooked in juvenile facilities. It talks about the importance of making sure that young people have access to their attorneys, because attorneys play an important role in expressing the interests and the desires of their clients. So it's very much a priority for the center, but it's something that we need to do more of. We need to make sure in everything that we do when we're talking about youth development that the youth voice is present.
Yeah, and I mean, in the research report, we do have some of the stories of youth in there, because I think we sort of developed this framework and it's very abstract, and for it to actually have meaning, it's tremendously important to have the stories of real young people inside of it. But kind of on a related note, not for this particular project, but one of the kind of more difficult or complicated audiences I've had to present research to is actually students, and trying to actually figure out how do you talk about research findings in a way that resonates with adolescents is one of the bigger challenges I've ever had in terms of presenting. But I think it's also tremendously important because it pushes me to think a lot harder about what does this actually mean, because if you have adolescents in front of you, you really can't just be trying to kind of have a whole bunch of facts. It actually has to be something that resonates with them, and that it's something that is relevant and usable as they're thinking about what they're going to be doing.
I'll be quick. A great question. I have to say that I have in the last couple of years said frustratingly to my staff, I barely see a kid every 6 months. So while having spent a lot of time in these kinds of settings in the past, it does get increasingly difficult, and your question's right on. I would also say that this is part of the evidence-based, research-based problem. When all the decision-making authority is coming from outside, you do get pretty disconnected from what's going on with the kids and with the people who are trying to support them. So as important as it is to have evidence-based practice, it's important to empower local people to use measures and to use research and to be their own decision makers. And so that's really where our focus has been. So it's not such a big deal that I, unfortunately, have not been able to, as a leader of an organization, have not been able to stay as connected as I'd like to be, because I'm trying to empower the adults to use scientific tools and their own reasoning and decision making much more effectively and confidently, because they are in touch with the subjects of this work. So it's a great question.
So I hope you recorded all that. And I do think it's a terrific question, and I know that I see that there's one more question. I have 1 minute left, so if it can be a fast question, we'll see if we can get you a fast answer.
All right, I'm Keshana Hiers from Louisville, Kentucky. I just had a statement and a fast question. I might just do my question to what she said, because I'm also an advocate for the community. I'm also a little work and worship in the community, so I do feel it's our responsibility to come to you guys and give the information that's needed for our kids in our community. I feel like that's very important. We're always complaining, but when we're out there getting evidence and doing research, I feel acclimated in the process, that I will never be sitting up there on the panel with you guys, but I will always be communicating. I will always be hands-on and engaged in what I'm doing. I feel like there's a job for everybody in this work. It takes a village. My question is, as far as doing evidence-based and everything you guys have researched, do you feel it's completely biased to get government officials, the people who's responsible for making the decisions about welfare, the kids in juvenile detention centers, and the parents, to get the parents to buy in, to create programs to empower the parents to be engaged with these children, putting them together, connecting them with their kids? We're always writing programs, having parents volunteer and doing community service that is unnecessary to what skills they need to develop and to be with their children. So my question is, do you feel like it's completely biased? Has anybody come to the table about the idea of how we can empower parents and make them become more responsible for the work that we're doing to get their assistance and help?
I'm going to basically tell you that I think without having the panel go through it, because I know we're out of time, you've again raised a critically important point of how do we really make sure, and I'm hoping that how do we make sure that parents and young people are actually empowered to not only know what the evidence is, but bring it into the context of their lives and extract the pieces that make sense to them and push that idea back up. And I'm hoping that using the word evidence over the course of this panel has not been heard as counter to really hearing information that comes in from practitioners. We'd be happy to have you up on the panel next year, so I'm going to come out there and find you, because this really is not about, you've got all the researchers up here talking about evidence, and you've got all the folks who are trying to actually do good for their communities sitting out in the audience. This is really what I hope you got out of this panel is you've got a commitment from folks who are on the research side to actually figure out how to really take apart that evidence, not just hand it to you in a box and say implement it, but actually work with you to see what the elements are that work, to really test out whether the practices that made sense in one setting make sense in another setting, and to really hear, most importantly, what's already working on your side that you'd like to help us get documented and pushed up, because you can see that it's working, but you often don't have the pieces in place to get the data to show that it's working. So I want to thank the panelists for what I clearly was a provocative panel, whether we meant it to be that way or not, and ask you all to join in a round of applause.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Good morning.
So I'm Chris Miner. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Forum. In previous years, I think I've called myself your cruise director, your Sherpa, and the voice in your head. I think after Tomi's gift of the Festival of Light, we'll have to come up with something, maybe your ambassadors of light, or
something
the
very
light of your life.
festive.
You can work on it. Let me know at the next
Rainbows
session.
of light, something.
I'm joined by my dear colleague.
I'm Angelina Garner from the Weikart Center. I'm the Senior Program Manager for National Advancement Initiatives. So welcome.
We just want to give a couple of quick admin announcements and help us set up the rest of the day. So Karen mentioned in your folder is a list of all of our participants. To give you a sense, a good chunk of you started the night last night with us in the opening reception out in the foyer. You'll see some of the evidence and pictures on the main screens as we're gathering. So thank you for the good time. There are 475 plus of you who have registered to join us, which is a joy for us who started 5 years ago in Nashville with 200 folks. So it's really exciting to see us grow year over year. You're from 38 states, plus the District of Columbia, plus a dear colleague and friend who came from the UK. So next year will be the first Ready by 21 international meeting. We're taking bids now for those who want to host.
Yep, so in preparation today, you all have had this wonderful booklet that is in your notebooks. As you see, when you open it up, you have a view at a glance and then also the map. So if you're looking for that, that's right there. And as you go through it, you'll see that it has all the workshop descriptions and where they're located. So that's there for you as a resource. Another resource is that you can find about anything that you need for this conference online. So also in your folders, you'll find this wonderful little card here. And it has three different things of information. One, how you can connect to the Wi-Fi network, so we know that's going to be very important for you. Twitter, for those of you who love to put out a tweet and say where you are and what you're doing, we'd love for you to do that. And then the conference agenda, you can also find this online. And online will also have all the PowerPoints, as well as all the resources that go with that.
Terrific. All right, so we're going to break in just about a minute. What's coming up is our first round of workshops. Within each round, there are 11 sessions. The 11 breakout rooms, there are 8 as you head out the ballroom to your right, and there are 3 lonely rooms over to your left, so take good care of them. We will use the same. We have the entire floor all day today and tomorrow. Always consult your map. Other thing I want to point out is all the staff members of the forum and its various divisions have these green or teal name tags or these yellow lanyards. So hopefully that helps you find us in a crowd. Grab any one of us if you should have questions. We'll help you find where you're trying to go. After the first round of workshops, we'll come back here for lunch. As Karen mentioned already, it is primarily a networking lunch, something you've asked for year over year, is some time without us talking from the main stage for you to get to connect across states and cities and networks. We'll do so again tomorrow morning for breakfast. There are great things throughout the 2 days. We have a wonderful closing plenary today with Russell and Ali joining us, an outstanding panel in the morning with federal, state, and local leaders moderated by Patrick McCarthy, the head of Annie Casey, and a closing panel you won't want to miss, the Voices of Young People moderated by a special correspondent from DC's NPR station. So I hope you'll stick with us for the few days. The sun is shining. It should be a good time. Other things in the admin category, a couple of you have already managed to lose some things. So if you've lost your laptop, your notebook, or your coat, There are some things behind the registration counter. That's where we'll take things throughout the few days, so you can always head there if you have a question or need anything. Anything else we need to cover?
I think that we've covered everything.
To follow up, the one other thing I will say, I'm glad you recorded the question, but I'm also happy to report all the plenaries are being recorded and will be posted to the website afterwards. So if you also have a question you want recorded, you can see it online after the national meeting. So enjoy the quick break and head to your sessions. Thanks very much.
Have a wonderful morning.